ways of being and knowing by slowing down and examining your relationship to land, ecology, and ancestry. Think about the original caretakers whose land you are occupying. Reflect on when and how you arrived to this land. And finally, consider how your examination will move you from acknowledgement to solidarity, kinship, and relationship building with Indigenous communities.
A warm hello and welcome to everyone. Give yourself a moment to arrive into the shared and co-created space. My name is Shirley Lay, she, her pronouns. I'm a partner at BIPOC Executive Search, and I've been given the honorable responsibility for offering the containment for today's programming. Now, before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement so that we can come together as one united mind and purpose. For Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only as a means of declaring sovereignty and treaty rights, but it is also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Takaranto is a Mohawk word that translates to the place in the water where the trees are standing. It has been the home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and many other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The area covered by Treaty 13 was signed with Mississaugas of the credit. For time immemorial, the lush waterways, rich soils, and purifying effects of the Great Lakes ecosystem have made it a place of abundance of food, medicines, knowledge, cultural exchange, and commerce for Indigenous peoples. Now for my non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. Honor Indigenous ways of being and knowing by slowing down to really see the world around you. Examine your relationship to land, ecology, and ancestry. Think about the original caretakers of the lands you are occupying. Reflect on when and how you arrived to this land. And finally, be moved by how your examination will get you from acknowledgement to solidarity, kinship, and relationship building with Indigenous communities. Now, our conversation today will be deeply rooted in Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 92 regarding business and reconciliation. Sometimes people say reconciliation in business, which is the action before the subject, but I like to say business in reconciliation, because this is an ongoing process that needs to be continually engaged and acted upon, invested in, reinvested in for your entire life, and then for the next few generations to come. Now, for those of you who need a reminder of what CTA 92 is, here it is on screen. Lots of words, let me break it down for you. Essentially, Call to Action 92 is to invite businesses and people within the corporate sector to begin to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework, and to detail some of the key pieces that need to be part of your action plan. Now, it lists these three in the order, as you can see here, but I'm going to give you a bit of a tip. My recommendation is to start with number 3 first. Essentially, it's about providing education to your own people within your place of learning, within your place of work, within your place of residence. Now, this education shouldn't come from the government. It shouldn't be defined by the Indigenous community. It should come from you and the people around you. And what it is that you need to learn is that Western European powers have used colonization as a means to satisfy their imperialistic agendas, and that involved the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples as a means to legitimately, sanctioned by law, to take land and extract resources. And it is those very beginnings that have led to the creation of reservations, of residential schools, of over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples in correction systems, and so on and so forth. It is only once you've educated yourself and your people, then you can come back to the first point, which is building meaningful connections. Connections that should be solidly built upon respect, upon reciprocity, mutuality, authenticity, and transparency. Once we have relationships, then we can enter into point 2, which is then we know how to ensure that Indigenous peoples have doors open with respect to jobs, training, and educational programs. And we're not just going to open the door for one person. We're going to keep the door open for as long as possible. Thank you for that. So the structure of our program today is going to be guided by witnessing practices that are common in Indigenous communities. Now, very much in line with their oral traditions, witnessing is a way of conducting business through relationship building. And the job of the witness is to listen, to retain, and to take very good care of the information that's been gathered. And once you've learned that information, you then share it with your people. Now, today, you're going to be observing 4 people from my firm, including myself. We're going to be providing you with excerpts of video and audio content that's produced by Indigenous communities. And once we've done that, we're going to be offering you our reflections and commitments for future actions. And while what you witness is very personal to us, by no means is this secretive. In fact, we want you to take inspiration and to begin incorporating this witnessing practice into your personal and professional lives. Now, I'm going to start with the witnessing myself. I have the pleasure of witnessing the work of Linda Epp, who I have had the honor of becoming acquainted with and learning from through my work at BIPOC Executive Search. Linda Epp is Sechelt Nation from the Sunshine Coast. She's the president and chief connector of Epic Connections. She called me the other day with abundance, joy, and exhilaration, telling me the great news that she's currently the senior Indigenous engagement specialist and team lead for truth and reconciliation at Two Worlds Consulting. And the biggest part about her share is that she told me she's working on a couple of big Crown Corporation contracts in insurance and transportation sectors. Now, what I'm going to show you is a clip of Linda Epp speaking at the Indigenous Women's Leadership Summit at Quest University in Squamish back in 2018. She gives us a context as to why she organizes the yearly Whistlers Sisters in Spirit Visual, and why she has furthered the work of the Red Dresses Initiative in Whistler as a means of commemorating Aboriginal women X, or girls gone missing and murdered. We're going to show you a clip of that now.
So I moved back up to Whistler. I moved from Whistler to Vancouver, and I went to the Native Education College in Vancouver. Wow, what another life-changing experience. It was the first time I was surrounded by so many Indigenous people. But it was the first time I really felt a sense of belonging, a sense of acceptance, a sense of home. I met other Indigenous people. I connected with them and I stepped right into my culture. This ignited something inside of me. It inspired me to have a voice for Indigenous people and to do something more. I continued on to Capilano University, where I obtained a degree in tourism, and I was the First Nation student liaison. I fell in love with learning about my culture. I ended up moving back to Whistler, and I worked with the House Sound Women's Centre Society. And at one of our meetings, we talked about a Sisters in Spirit vigil. And I was familiar with the vigils because I was involved with them as a student. And so on October 4th, that's the day that we honor the Aboriginal women who have gone missing and murdered in Canada. Vigils are held all across Canada. There's been over 1,000 women who have gone missing and murdered in Canada. So I felt I needed to organize a Sisters in Spirit Vigil in Whistler. We're in the backyard in Lilwat Nation, Mount Currie. Families have been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women. Here in Squamish Nation, families have been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women. All Indigenous people have been affected by missing and murdered women, girls, two-spirited, men, boys. So I stand for them. I have a voice. I stand for those families who feel beaten down, who feel like they can't fight anymore. I stand for those people that feel that their voice isn't being heard. Prior to the vigil, I wanted to provoke thought and discussion. So I hung red dresses around Whistler. And a red dress signifies an Aboriginal woman or girl who has gone missing. Jamie Black first hung red dresses at the University of Winnipeg in 2011, and I thought it was a powerful, impactful statement. So I went around and I asked for local support.
So after this clip, Linda Epp goes on to talk about how she hung red dresses at various local businesses. Now, if you felt intrigued, compelled by what she said, I invite you to continue on watching and witnessing her content on YouTube. Googling her name, you'll find her content. So today, I'm going to bear witness to 3 pieces of her share. The first is the aspect where she details her experience at the Native Education College in Vancouver. And I'm going to pull up a quote here. She said, "It was the first time that I was surrounded by so many Indigenous people. It was the first time I really felt a sense of belonging, a sense of acceptance, and a sense of home." She then goes on to say, "I stepped into my culture. This ignited something inside of me and inspired me to have a voice for Indigenous people and to do something more." This very, very important statement is telling us about the importance of representation, of why seeing herself reflected in her cohort was so important to her. She's telling us it gives her identity, purpose, meaningfulness in relationship to others. It helped give containment to her personhood from which she can start to make sense of the world, connecting her past to her future. And so what I'd like to do is to invite the audience to tie the lesson she gave us here back into one of the pieces on CTA 92, which is building meaningful consultation. If we want to build relationships that are grounded in respect and trust, then we have to give space to these stories and these conversations. We have to really hear the meaning and the intent behind these stories and to give time and space. In our really capitalistic world, we're very hung up on thinking about time is money, time is precious. And so often we don't give people, Indigenous people, enough time and space to tell their stories. If we are to build any kind of meaningful connection, we must first take time to hear these stories and to be influenced and impacted by them. Because this is how we're going to participate in the work of ensuring that there is an intergenerational transmission of wealth and knowledge within the Indigenous community. The second piece I want to witness is the part where she disclosed talking about being included as part of Capilano University, completing a degree program in tourism. And at that location, she became involved with the First Nation student liaison. Once graduated, she then moved on to work with the House Sound Women's Society, supporting them in organizing and creating movements. This point that she taught us ties in very nicely with the second component of CTA 92, which is equitable access. This is what it means when you give one Indigenous person an opportunity to enter into a space of learning and education. And through there, Linda was able to integrate what was offered to her, including what she has learned through her ancestral history, integrating it together to give her life vitality, color, and meaning. And once she felt empowered, once she felt affirmed, then that was where she began giving back to her community so that she can uplift more voices. So know that when we participate as businesses, as corporate sectors, when we give equitable access, you're not just giving that to one person, but that there's a ripple effect to access giving. And so think about those pieces. When you support the learning and the life journey of one Indigenous person, you know, given their collectivistic culture, that they're going to be paying that forward for the generations to come. And know that it is not our job, not the business or corporate sector, to be empowering anyone. We offer the tools on the table. Indigenous members choose which tools they would like to take to incorporate into their worldviews, and then they will work on ensuring that there's more access to all. So that's how the equation should be. The last piece that I'm going to mention in my witnessing is she talked very emphatically, and I invite everyone to rewatch that piece. Her tone of voice increases by saying, we are all impacted when Indigenous women X or girls go missing and murdered, and that her engagement of hanging red dresses is a symbol of protest, is a symbol of remembrance. It's a means of interrupting space, of dialogue, of inviting people into conversation. And so this last piece ties in with one of the final pieces on CTA 92, which is about education building within your networks and systems. It is our responsibility to ensure the well-being of Indigenous women X and girls. It doesn't just fall on the laps and shoulders of Indigenous peoples. We are all implicated in this. We should all be implicated in this. And so the next time that Indigenous organizer comes knocking on your door, asking if they could hang a rank dress on your door, now you know what it means. And hopefully you feel compelled to say yes. With that, I'm going to close my witness sharing. I'm going to now invite my esteemed colleague, Melissa Somnoth, partner at BIPOC Executive Search, into this witnessing space.
I'll start off with reading this quote from Justice Maurice Sinclair. While Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathens, savages, and pagans, and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country. You know, that what Justice Maurice Sinclair is talking about is the education system and how the education system in our country perpetuated these negative belief systems around Indigenous people. And so before I share my witnessing video of Len Pierre, I'll talk a little bit around who Len Pierre is. Len Pierre is Coast Salish Katzie First Nations, who is an educator and consultant, has his own firm called Len Pierre Consulting. And one of the offerings that Len shares is Indigenous cultural safety training and education programs. The video that you're about to witness is from TEDxSFU's Bloom series. And leading up to this part of the video, I'll share some context pieces. You know, Len shares a pivotal moment in his teaching career, how a newcomer had fled their home country because of oppression and violence to come to this free and beautiful country, and took Len's training education programs. Then to realize that this country we are in has a history of colonial and state violence. And that this training also forever changed how this person would view Indigenous people in this country. Len explains that this game-changing moment in his teaching career was this moment of the human and the hurt in me sees the human and the hurt in you. And as human beings, we're driven for the need for information and knowledge. When we don't have that knowledge, we tend to feel left out. And so sharing of information and knowledge is incredibly important when we're talking about Indigenous cultural safety and training. This is why this training is so important. Len calls it a blueprint to reconciliation, and I really appreciate this perspective that Shirley shared around business in reconciliation. Len goes on to share, this training can really be the bridge to close our gaps of awareness and knowing. The other piece that I wanted to share before the video goes up is this idea around that Len shares around Indigenous racism being isolated events. We know that this shows up in our healthcare system, he shares, with the death of Joyce Ekwon, who died in a Quebec hospital and who went live over a social media feed documenting the racist treatment they experienced. Len shares in the justice system with Colton Bushi, who was gunned down, in our education systems. And Len also shares the lobster wars that happened in 2020, where non-Indigenous fishermen burnt down the boats and boat sheds of Indigenous communities. And so education, information, and knowledge sharing are key components here. And with that, we'll put up the video as part of our witnessing.
The thing to do, it seems to me, is to really, embark on a learning journey. And I think it's appropriate and fitting that, the theme for this conference is bloom, because we are blooming blossoms all over the place for organizations and citizens who are taking up this learning journey for reconciliation and Indigenous cultural safety. It is in motion and it's alive and well today. Indigenous cultural safety in education, no two programs are the same because this is emerging work. But my own I would say, formula for a really good, robust Indigenous cultural safety education program consists of these three core areas. The first is an awareness of our history. So that is learning about the residential school, the 60s scoop, land theft, the potlatch ban, smallpox epidemic. The second sphere for a good cultural safety program would be an examination of power imbalances. So talking and learning about systemic racism, institutional oppression, and how it manifests. And how it manifests, you would think it's quite explicit and covert, but it's actually not. You have to really read between the lines. So putting a pause to learn about those power imbalances is essential. And then, of course, landing on this place of what can we do about it? As adult learners, we're always like, okay, we love hearing the problem, but more importantly, we really love knowing what we can do about it. So we want to land every cultural safety education program on these anti-racism strategies, so that every single citizen who belongs to an organization, no matter what organization you work for, have these new strategies you can apply into your practice and into your daily lives every single day. And that looks like aspects of calling in instead of calling out racism. And of course, learning and recognizing the traditional lands and territories in which we all live, work, and play. So I have no calls to action. I have no prescription. And I have no request or recommendation. Instead, for each and every one of you, I have an invitation. And I invite all of you, each and every one of you, who are listening to my voice, learning, leaning in, YouTubing. I invite you to embark on a learning journey called Indigenous Cultural Safety Education and Training. And embark on this learning journey that will transform the way you look at this country and its people. And more importantly, strengthen that relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike. Not just for today, but more importantly, for tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you
so much. As part of my witnessing of this video, there's a few things that really came through for me. One was the strengthening of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I think that ties in terms of call to action number 92. And in particular, the piece around respect, reciprocity, mutuality, authenticity. The other piece that I witnessed in this video was the sweatshirt that Len's wearing. It says strong, resilient, and Indigenous, versus some of the pieces that our media will share us or our systems will share with us around inferiority. That's a political statement that Len's wearing on his body. The other piece that came through very strongly was around the active part of working on the relationship, the embarking part of the learning journey, and that the Indigenous cultural safety training program should be robust. So I'll land on the 3 areas that Len Pierre shared. The first is learning about the history. You know, the fact is the Indian Act still exists today. Residential schools only ended in 1994, the last school. I was in high school. That's not that long ago. The 60s scoop did not stay in the 60s. It's still here. And so learning about the history. Len talks about the potlatch ban. This was a ban on ceremonies. So learn about that history. An examination of power imbalances, really taking stock, learning about systemic racism, institutional oppression, and how it manifests. And the piece that he ends off with is, what can we do about it in terms of anti-racist strategies? Len talks about calling in instead of calling out racism, calling in racism, having a dialogue about it. There's an invitation here that ties into call to action number 2 around providing education for your people in work, in your residence, right? And entering into that together, going back to something that Shirley had said around the ripple effects of that learning. Len also talks about education being the vehicle to help bridge the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Together, we'll be able to be stronger. And so the invitation that I have for you is to take a look at the video. You'll be able to find it on TED Talk. Take a look at Len Pierre Consulting on LinkedIn. Do Google search on Len Pierre. You'll be able to find more information about him. And with that, over to my wonderful colleague, Helen McConan, who's also partner here at BIPOC Executive Search.
There's certainly an element of discussing the history of it, but I use wampum belts, and not a lot of people do or have made a study of that, and that provides an understanding of the treaty relationship that I don't think exists among a lot of people, and there are the significance about those belts is both spiritual, it's contractual, it's moral, it's ethical, and the meaning that those belts carry also has a relationship to, I guess, what we call land-based education, because the beads from which those belts are made talk about the relationship with the water and how important that is, and not just a relationship between humans, but between humans and the earth that we walk on, and that the treaty relationship was seen as a way to enhance the relationship between humans, but also to protect the environment that the humans are using. In most cases, people of all ages have a fascination for the wampum belts. They're something tangible. People can touch them. It's not just words on a page. the words which are usually very old and archaic, English, for example. And when we discuss how the belts were made, for example, the painstaking way that they said a couple of hundred years ago it could take a woman 2 days to craft one bead from a quahog shell, which is only found in one place in the world, off the eastern coast of Turtle Island, North America. And when people learn things like these shells are now recognized by modern science as being perhaps the oldest living creatures, the quahog, they have found them 500 years old, so that speaks to the special meaning they had for the people who wove them into the belts, that those agreements were supposed to last forever. When people can actually handle an agreement as opposed to just read about it, I've noticed that it even from people at the highest levels, even political people, judges. I was at a session in Toronto a week ago, and Justice Tony Mandaman was asking me questions about the belts that he hadn't learned about in schools in all his education. So yeah, that seems to be a way that people feel that the belts have a more special personal meaning than, again, just words.
So what you saw in that short clip is Maurice Switzer, a citizen of the Mississaugas of Aldervale First Nation, who's a journalist, an educator, and a commissioner within the Human Rights Commission, speak about wampum belts. He spoke about the fascination that many people have, and I too I am part of that population of individuals who have become very fascinated by the belt, by the wampum belt. When witnessing this event, what I heard were elements of care, elements of thoughtfulness, elements of intent in relation to the wampum belt. Care in the crafting of each bead. He spoke about the painstaking craft of building each bead from the quahog shell. I think about the thoughtfulness of connecting truly the activity on land with the land by the tangible element of what the wampum belt is and what it represents. Also thinking about where the quahog being part of being a creature of water, close to the creator, and when thinking about the intent, and that would be the third piece and the third element that I want to share around the specifics of the video, is the treaty to be there until the end of time, and the wampum belt representing that. And again, thinking about the origin and the source of the quahog being, as Maurice put it, one of the oldest living creatures known to modern science. This video, and I do encourage you to continue watching it. There are many other elements that Maurice Switzer brings to the conversation around land, learning from the land, Indigenous learning as well. And in thinking about the words in the video, the element, and Melissa raised this as well, of reciprocity, of community, and in the context of relationships, and nation-to-nation relationships, and the commitment that was made with the exchange. And when we look at ink today, it dissipates, it disappears. This is a treaty that was made. The treaties that were made were meant to last till the end of time. As a learner, I came to learn about the wampum belts through the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course that is provided by the First Nation University of Canada, where there was an expert from Maurice, Switzer, speaking about wampum belts, and I felt deeply connected to that, and I encourage the audience and individuals who are watching today to continue to learn. And through my learning of the course, I started my own learning journey, and have watched and learned from a number of videos from the National Center for Collaboration in Indigenous Education, where elders speak about coming into Indigenous education with an open heart and an open mind. And through this particular witnessing and this particular video, I am reminded of, again, the deep importance of relationships, relationships between human beings, relationships between human beings and animals and nature, and really reconnecting to the earth. But also reflecting on the importance of upholding your role of the relationship. And so with Call to Action 92, and thinking about business, business in the business world, and how corporations are being called to act, I think about economics versus economics. And so that essentially what that means is we need to really think through how our relationships affect not only the parties that are involved and are visible, but also the ones that aren't. So that would be my takeaway in the spirit of reciprocity. Again, in learning through an open mind and an open heart, and invite you all to do the same. And with that, I will introduce Jason Murray, President and Managing Partner at BIPOC Executive Search.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you so much, Shirley. It's really an honor to be with everyone who is watching today, everyone who will watch this in future as this video will be made available. I have a video that I'm going to show you shortly after I make some prefacing remarks. And the video is actually something that was produced by CBC News. And it's Senator Maurice Sinclair. And the topic is, how can Canadians work towards reconciliation? And, just in terms of Maurice Sinclair's background, which I know many people are familiar with, but he's a former member of the Canadian Senate and First Nations lawyer who served as chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2009 to 2015. He previously served as a judge in Manitoba from 1988 to 2009, being the first Indigenous judge appointed in that province. He was appointed to the Senate of Canada on April 2nd, 2016, and in November 2020, he announced his retirement from the Senate effective January 31st, 2021. This information is made available on Wikipedia. If anyone wants to learn more, I encourage you to do so. I'm going to ask that the video be queued up, and then from there, we'll see a quote that I would like to witness and respond to.
Of how to get involved in reconciliation, what advice would you have for them?
Well, I always tell them you're already involved, whether you like it or not. This is not a This is not an audience sport. Reconciliation is a participant sport, and they're already engaged. So the question is, how are you engaged? And how do you want to change your engagement? That's the real question. And when people ask me, what can I do? I will say, well, first of all, read the report. Read the summary at least. I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And if you can't figure it out after that, read the calls to action and figure out which one of those interests you or which one of those you can do something about. And then do something, because people who can should.
What makes you hopeful for the future?
You. And others like you. Because you have an interest in making change. You have children, and your children will have children. And we believe in our children. We believe that we have an obligation to make change for our children. And that's what's key. As long as we have that belief in the need to improve the future, then the future will be improved.
So there is a quote in there that really stood out for me that I want to be able to comment on specifically. And I'm going to read this quote. You're already involved, whether you like it or not. This is not an audience sport. Reconciliation is a participant sport. They're already engaged. So the question is, how are you engaged? And how do you want to change your engagement? Read the calls to action and figure out which one of those interests you or which one of those you can do something about, and then do something, because people who can should. Very, very powerful. Hearing Justice Sinclair talk about the fact that we're already involved, whether you like it or not, is something that I think we should all bring into our consciousness. Thinking about the fact that for so many of us who are not Indigenous, we are not original inhabitants to this land. And so we cannot passively think about ourselves as people who are not involved in reconciliation. There are so many different quotes around, when you're not making a decision, you actually are making a decision. When you're not prioritizing something, you're prioritizing something else. And so I really encourage people to think about what statement they're making if they're not actually proactively participating in so much of this work. Another thing that he mentions is, how are you engaged and how do you want to change your engagement? And goes on to say which ones of the calls to actions, that is, interest you, and then do something. So when I think about our own firm here, there's a number of things that we do. And I want to share some of the things that we do, because I think sometimes when other organizations have some examples, they can think about how they can meaningfully and genuinely participate in Call to Action 92. So with respect to our firm, all of us are constantly learning, and we ensure that we're a part of spaces where we have an opportunity to share. And what that means is we have to learn. So even us doing this live today, we are learning so much because we know that we're going to have an opportunity to share. So we would encourage people to put yourself into spaces where you actually have to learn. So incentivize yourself to be a part of the whole learning piece. We also like to make sure that we are sponsoring different activities and initiatives that are being put up or designed by members of the Indigenous community. So an example is Indigenous fashion arts. It's really important for us to be in community. And so this particular Thursday and Friday, and I know that many people probably saw our post, the Indigenous Legacy Gathering that is happening at Nathan Phillips Square on September 29th and 30th. So really making sure that we are in the community. And there's a number of other things that we do here as well, including the fact that we are an executive search firm. And part of our mandate is to do whatever we can to help organizations and to help individuals from communities that have been historically marginalized, including Indigenous folks, to be in positions of leadership and be integrated in all organizations. I really love the point as well, where the interviewer says, "What makes you hopeful for the future?" And the response is you. And if you look back at the video at 6 minutes and 23 seconds, you can see in Justice Sinclair's eyes just how important it is for all of us to digest his response when he says you, and then he says, and others like you, you have an interest in making change. Even the tone of his voice is something that sits with me. So when I'm witnessing this and I'm thinking about how it's landing, I'm thinking about what I'm able to observe in his eyes, what I'm able to hear in his voice, and just feel like that message about wanting to see legacy improvements for future generations is just really compelling and really, really profound. So that hope that he has is something that I would encourage everybody to have. But of course, it means that we all have to be in action. Just thinking about the business community, and when he says, people who can, should. Now, the business community is a very powerful community across Canada. There are resources, there are funds, there are people that can all mobilize towards making profound change. And so if you can do something, you should. And it can be things that are similar to some of the things that we are doing here. And it can certainly be other things as well. But we would encourage everybody that is watching today and everyone who really wants to make sure that they are part of the second year of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in a meaningful way, to really reflect, to honor, reflect, and act. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Shirley Lay, who will outro us from today's live. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, Helen, and Jason, for your labor in sharing with us your witnessing piece that we should all learn from. Now, in the last moments of our shared space, I want to leave you with 3 resources that you can engage in on September 30th, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and Orange Shirt Day, and beyond. So I'm going to put up on screen several resources. The first of which is what Jason Murray had already shared with us today. If you are in the Takaranto area and you're able to make it to Nathan Phillips Square, we strongly recommend you doing so on this Thursday and Friday, an event held by the Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Centre's Indigenous Legacy Gathering. If you're not able to make it to that event, there is another event on the same day. This is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation panel. This will be held at Women's College Hospital. And finally, if transportation is an issue, we invite you to learn online on that day of and beyond. United Nations has offered a free e-learning tool in teaching you about the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, we have tons more resources other than these pieces, but we will mention these 3 on air right now to you, as these are the pieces that we're most invested in. And for others who want to learn about other pieces, we're going to be sharing all of these resources on a LinkedIn post, and we're going to put that up as soon as possible so that people have access to it. We'll also put in links of all the videos that we had witnessed in today's event so that people can review at their own time and pace. Thank you, everyone, for choosing to be in this share space today. And we hope that you're going to be taking some of the pieces that resonate with you back into your personal and professional lives. We all have a part in furthering TRC CTA number 92, So come and be moved to action with all of us. Thank you. Take good care.